Okay, in section 8.5, we're going to be looking at adding and subtracting the rational expression. So when you're adding and subtracting fractions, you have to have a least common denominator. So that's what we're going to look at first, is just how do you figure out what your least common denominator is. So of course that's what your LCD stands for. Now a least common denominator is just the same thing as a least common multiple. But looking at the first one here, one thing that you've got to keep in mind is when things are connected by multiplication versus subtraction. So the way that I'm going to determine my least common denominator here is going to be different from what I do here, because here you've got the terms that are, being added or subtracted. Here everything is connected by multiplication. So when you've got everything here connected by multiplication, then you're allowed to look at like your numbers, figure out what you need there, and then look at each of the individual variables. So with 8 and 12, same thing that you've always done. What's going to be the smallest number that 8 and 12 will both go into? Not what's going to go into them, but what will they go into? So between 8 and 12, that's going to need to be a 24. Okay, like I said, same thing that you would have always done with a common denominator. Now, when it comes to your variables, here I've got x squared and here I've got x to the fourth. Picking your least common denominator of the same variable, the easiest way to remember to do it is you've got to go with the largest exponent. So this is the opposite of doing greatest common factor. Okay, greatest common factor, you go with your smallest exponent. With least common denominator or least common multiple, you go with your larger exponent. So this would have to be x to the fourth power. Now, this term has a y, this term doesn't have a y. Again, this is different from greatest common factor. You have to include in your least common denominators all of the different factors that you see. So even though this doesn't have a y, because this one does, I have to include that over here as part of my least common denominator, okay? Now, with the second example that I have here, like I said, we kind of have to deal with it different when you have the addition and the subtraction with your terms. What you need to do first is do whatever factoring that needs to be done. So there's some factoring that I can do here with this first term. First of all, I can take out a 5. So that will leave me with y squared minus 16. But then I can go another step of factoring, because y squared minus 16 is the difference of squares. So that's going to be y plus 4 times y minus 4. Okay. Now, picking your common denominator. When you have terms that are connected by a plus or a minus, like those things have to stay together, meaning I can't look at my y and my 4 differently here, okay? So I've got to include the factor of 5. That's got to be part of my common denominator. Now I've got a y plus 4 here and a y plus 4 over here. So when you have the same factor that's showing up, you go with a larger power. Just like I did with the x a while ago, I explained that I needed to go with a larger power. But in both cases, they're just understood to be to the first power. This is to the first power, and this is understood to be to the first power. So then we're just going to go with y plus 4 to the first power. Okay, now this one includes y minus 4. This doesn't, but going back to what I explained a while ago, it doesn't have to be in both of them, okay? Like I said, this is not the same as greatest common factor. So whatever you see as far as factors, all of those have to be included. So this would be your least common denominator. All right, on the third one, again, let's go in and let's do our factoring that we can do. So the x squared minus 1 is the difference of squares. That's x plus 1 times x minus 1. All right, now here we're going to have x plus 1 times x plus 1, which is the same thing as x plus 1 squared. So you do need to consider this as x plus 1 squared just to make sure that you're picking your common denominator correctly. All right, so when I compare the two things that I have, Here I have x plus 1 times x minus 1, and here I have x plus 1 squared. So I've got x plus 1 in both of them, but they have different powers. So that one's understood to be the first power, but this one's to the second power, so you have to go with the larger power. Okay, I've got the x minus 1 here. Even though I don't have any of those over here, I still have to include it. It has to be part of my common denominator. Okay, so that's going to be the first thing that we're going to actually end up doing, of course, with each of these problems, is figuring out what our common denominator needs to be. Okay, so here's a couple of just little notes or steps that you need to make sure that you remember. First of all, you need to factor any of your denominators. Of course, going back to those problems that I just finished going over with you before I picked my common denominator, that's what I had to do. I had to factor, okay? So factor your denominators first, then figure out your least common denominator, and then it says when adding or subtracting, you only add or subtract your numerators, and then once you do that, what you're going to do last is work on simplifying the fraction. Okay, so that's just kind of the process that we're going to go through here. All right, so find each sum or difference and then state restrictions. Now, we talked about restrictions with the last section, so that's still going to be the same here. Okay, common denominator. These two sections, or these two denominators, are the same, so you already have a common denominator. So when you go to work this, if you've got a common denominator, that's just going to transfer over. And the only thing that you actually add or subtract is going to be your numerators. Okay, so I have the 6x minus 4 minus 3x plus 1. Now, to simplify your numerator here, you will have to distribute your minus sign. So you'll have a minus 3x and a minus 1. Okay, so then combining like terms, 6x minus 3x is 3x, and negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5. Okay. Now, if you could simplify at this point, then you would, but there's not any simplifying that you can do. Now, simplifying is what we learned how to do in the previous section in 8.4. You know, so like if you could factor some stuff here and then cancel, you know, top and bottom, then that's what you would do. Now, on stating your restrictions, and actually you could have done that before we ever did the actual subtraction. Remember, your restrictions with your rational functions are going to be with your denominator. So take your x squared minus 5, and you're going to set that equal to 0. So I would get x squared is equal to 5. So x is equal to plus or minus square root 5. So these are going to be your restrictions. Anything that causes your denominator to equal 0 will be your restriction.